security in this phenomenon, in this existing system. And that's why China is trying to use economic ways to construct a more favorable environment, and to use this to confront threat from China, from United States. So one thing I want to stress is that Zhou Xiaochuan, which is the former governor of the People's Bank of China, he actually said something very interesting, that he advocated for a reroute during the trade war. He says that, okay, if the US is trying to sanction our trade and trying to like boycott our goods, we can try to reroute. We can enlarge the trade volume that China has with developing world, or even with Europe, instead of like selling all the goods to the United States. So I think this part is quite important. This is the entire logic behind Belt and Road Initiative, is that we want to support the developing countries to have a better economy. If they have better economy, they have better markets. And so that both of us would benefit from this, and this can protect the developing countries from the economic dominance of the United States. And I think this is the entire purpose of the Belt and Road Initiative. And of course, US has its Indo-Pacific Strategy, which the concept was initially developed by Australian officials and then developed by the Japanese. Most famously, Shinzo Abe, the Japanese Prime Minister, he stressed the concept of JAI in his conversation with Modi. And in Hindi, I believe that word means victory. And the entire logic of the Indo-Pacific strategy is very different from BRI, because BRI doesn't have a target, but Indo-Pacific strategy does. The target is China. It's a military and mostly political strategy, and is aiming directly at one country. That's very different from the nature of the BRI. So we talk about, for countries like Nepal, what does BRI mean? What does IPS mean? As I said, IPS has a very strategic motive to contain or even to invade China. They want to gather basically US, Japan, Australia, India, and preferably some ASEAN countries in their plan. I mean, this may not work out, but in their plan, they plan to also like drag some ASEAN countries into this plan to contain or even to invade China. And it's mostly political, it's mostly military, it's mostly offensive in terms of strategy. But BRI is quite different. BRI has geopolitical considerations. As I just said, China also wants to create a better or more favorable environment for itself. But BRI doesn't have a clear strategic motives. And actually, if you look at the Chinese government's attitude over the BRI, we're actually open to even talking, like inviting the United States to join the BRI. And also a lot of European countries are invited. Italy has already joined. So it's a very non-political and mostly economic initiative that helps the development. So for Nepal or for like other countries, mostly in Asia, BRI should be, in my opinion, more attractive than IPS because it's less dangerous. By joining the BRI, I don't really see any like potential threats or potential danger that a country would face. But joining the IPS is quite dangerous because there is a risk that you'll be used as a tool of the United States to against China. And no matter what the result is, United States is very far. It's on the other side of the Pacific, while you are like literally on the Chinese border. So if you are used as a tool by the United States against another country, you are the one that is bearing the danger. So regarding this US-China competition, there's geopolitics and there's like even civilizational and even racial or like racist ideas behind those. So I have noticed that a lot of Indian scholars or like US scholars, they want to stress that, US as a so-called democratic country is united with India, another so-called democratic country according to the Western bourgeois democracy sense. saying that way the democracies unite against a so-called authoritarian Chinese state. But the problem is that, is it really like that? As Russian President Vladimir Putin actually, he said that before the USSR was gone, people thought that, okay, if we change our system, if we do the same system that US is doing, okay, our conflict would be solved. But now the USSR is gone, but NATO missiles are literally on Russian border. So this is a geopolitical competition rather than an ideological competition. So if India eventually chose to side with the United States, one day in the future, India will face the same threat from the United States that China is facing right now, because it's geopolitical. It's not a mere ideological competition. There's also civilizational ideology. As we all know, like this person named Samuel Huntington, a professor from Harvard University, he wrote this sort of like infamous book called Clash of Civilizations. And he also wrote another book called Who Are We?, which is basically like another version of Clash of Civilizations. Basically talking about different civilizations just cannot find the universal value among them, and different civilizations are bonded to clash with each other. That thing is very influential in the current Trump administration's entire foreign policy mentality. So this person named Kiram Skinner, she was the former US State Department's former director of policy planning of the Trump administration. And she said that, oh, the competition between the Soviet Union and the United States is more like a fight within the Western family. But right now, the competition against China, she says, is really against different civilization. And this word, she said, I think is also striking that this is the first time that we will have a great power competitor that is not Caucasian. So what this, like the importance of this word is that she demonstrated that United States is using civilizational or even racial lens or approach to understand the current China-US competition. And this is extremely dangerous. And I hope that South Asian countries would realize this as well, and realize that we are not regarded as members of the white Western family. We can talk about like Nepal's interest, because Nepal's interests really matter. So what Nepal needs right now is that Nepal needs funding, technology, infrastructure for development, right? Nepal does not need to be dragged into some competition between two giants, and especially Nepal does not need to be used as a tool. That's Nepal's interest. Nepal needs peace. Nepal doesn't want to be used as a pawn against China or against the United States or against any country. Nepal needs national independence. We all know that Nepal is sort of dependent on a lot of trade issues, also dependent on the South. And Nepal's core interest should be trying to drag more players, including China, including Russia, maybe including Europe, drag more players into the place to balance out the overwhelming influence from the South. And that's Nepal's interest. So according to this, why wouldn't Nepal want to side with the US or with India on this this issue? And also like in June, the Singaporean Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong, he actually has this famous quote. He said, the US is a hegemonic power that is constantly projecting influence to Asia, while China is a reality that cannot be moved. So what I want to say is that hegemons come and go. We look at history and there's none such a hegemonic empire that will stay forever. They rise, they fall, but neighbors are irrevocable. China has been neighbor of Nepal and of India, of all the South Asian countries for thousands of years already. And we will continue to be there forever, to the last day of Earth. But we don't know whether the United States will be still able to be the hegemon and projecting influence after 50 years. That's something that I think everyone should think about. And we should ask, what can Nepal get from IPS? US even quitted WHO because US feel like it doesn't want to pay the money. So would US be the one helping Nepal to modernize, to develop economy? Would MCC be the ideal ideal plan, which clearly compromises the national security of Nepal? How's US historical record treating those quasi-allies? From the 1965, how US treated the No Dinh Diem, the South Vietnamese regime, when they're losing, US just abandoned them. In 2019, last year, US sold out its Kurdish allies in Syria. So how reliable is US when we talk about quasi-alliance? And how important are the relatively smaller South Asian countries to the US compared to India? Let's say if US really wants to get a friend in the region to contain China, India would be the perfect one to choose because it's large. It's relatively more powerful. So if you look at the history of the United States, you would clearly see that they are very realistic in terms of consideration. They can easily sell out the interest of smaller countries to satisfy the demand of larger countries, as long as this larger country is in ally with the United States against China. This can very easily happen. So, and also, what does US demand South Asian country to do? If you take loans from US or if you join the IPS or something, US wants to have a say in your domestic politics. US want to force you to do privatization, economic liberalization, doing some sort of specific political structure. Those are the demands of the United States. But how about China? What demand does China have? There's only one demand, which is respect one China policy. And that's what other countries have been doing since the entire time. Like in the case of Nepal, it's only like Tibet. But we all know that Nepal has a very good relationship with China on this issue since the kingdom time to the present. So we talk about the post-COVID-19 world a little bit. I would have some sort of observations and a little bit predictions for the future. First, I feel like globalization is moving to a new direction and moving more toward regional economic integration. So right now you see that actually China's major trade, China's largest trade partner at this moment is ASEAN countries, because ASEAN countries has already surpassed the trade volume of Europe since this month. And the second thing is that unipolar world order is moving toward the end faster than everyone thought about. And one thing quite interesting is that Mexico made a proposal at the UN General Assembly saying that no matter which country developed the vaccine first, smaller countries should have equal access to it. So why does Mexico propose this plan? Because Mexico doesn't trust the United States. It does not believe that the United States is going to share the vaccine if it's accomplished. So this means that US leadership, as we know it, is actually degrading very fast. Irish newspaper actually said that this is the first time that people feel pity for the United States. Historically, people either love the United States or hate the United States. But this is the first time that people started to feel like they pity the United States. And third thing is that Western bureau democracy faces challenges, and when the coronavirus pandemic broke out in January in China, a lot of Western media say, "Oh, this is a Chernobyl of China. This means that Chinese system fails." But let's look at right now, whose system fails, right? So the diversity of civilization is going to be more valued in the future in terms of ideological discussion, and the so-called end of history is proven to be false. And the fourth one is the neoliberalism proven to be problematic, because even right now, France, under the leadership of Macron, Macron is quite liberal. But even him recognized that France need to nationalize its hospital, need to nationalize its medicine field in order to face the threat of the COVID-19. Another thing is that Western-centric world order is coming to an end. South-South cooperation is the new future, as I just talked about. China's major trade partner has become ASEAN, and the second one is European Union, and the United States is on the third one. So there's this trend of developing countries getting more together and developing countries pushing for more of economic growth and development in the future. And last thing is that unfortunately, China-US relation has exacerbated much more than we thought. Because historically, we actually talk about how global governance can be a glue tying China and the United States together, that we would holding hand in hand against all of those disasters like climate change or anything. But this time, COVID-19 comes out, and China-US relationship became really terrible. So there's this trend that this China-US relationship is probably going to continue exacerbating in the future. And the US takes very unbelievably irresponsible actions. Like this week, they just created WHO. And, but I want to stress one thing is that China-US relationship is very different from traditional rivalry. It's very different from the US-Soviet relationship. Yeah, that's all what I want to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chang, for your insightful remarks on the topic. Now I would like to request to present his deliberation to Associate Professor Dr. Katak Malla. Malla sir, the floor is yours.
Hello, yeah. Can you hear me, please?
Yeah, it's clear, sir.
Okay. Can I use my screen here?
Yeah, you can do it.
Okay. Desktop. Can you see my presentation?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. Me? Okay, yeah. Well, thank you very much for inviting me for this program. And as I was asked to speak something about change and uncertainty in the US-China relations and its impact in South Asia particularly, and maybe throughout the world as a whole. My intention or interest is to present today is to start from Nepal, perhaps. As I see it, Nepal is the heart of Asia, in my opinion. And changing US-China relations will certainly make impact on Nepal, relating its relation with China itself and with India also. But there are some facts we have to take into account that Kathmandu has become a home of international spying nowadays. There is a network of international spy in Kathmandu. And when I was reading Thomas Bell's book, Kathmandu, so he has described very interestingly how international spying network is working in Kathmandu. So Kathmandu in itself has become a center of Asian politics or even international politics. Another fact we have to take into account is the fact that there are foreign ambassadors openly engaged in national politics. It's not only China and India, but the major power ambassadors are some of them openly, others behind the scene, influencing Nepali politics. And but what should Nepal's approach be in the changing world? especially in terms of changes and uncertainty in the relationship between China and India. This is what I would like to conclude at the end. But let me start what I want to say. There are several points that I wanted to raise. It's a very wide topic. Talking about China-India relations is a very huge area of issues. The earlier speaker had spoken some specific things which I really liked. And but there are some current issues which are very interesting, in fact, to be discussed. I would very much like to have a discussion on theory. In other words, how do we theorize practice into theory? Also, how do we see practices from the theoretical point of view? This is what is my interest in talking about China-India relations. Huntington was earlier mentioned, and the Clash of Civilization, and there was another guy who wrote End of History, Fukuyama. Actually, the End of History, the End of Fukuyama has already been discussed by some of the critical thinkers, especially Edward Said and others. But there are new versions of Huntington and Fukuyama also. Recently, when I was reading some literature, Kishore Mubiani, and there is another guy, John Mesheimer. They have written a very interesting book about, has the West lost it, I mean towards the East, or can China rise peacefully? This is the discussion ongoing at this moment of time when we talk about changes and uncertainty in China-India relations. And they have completely two diametrical analysis about that. One is saying that yes, China will rise peacefully. China has never been an aggressive power in the past, except 1962 China-India war. And there are signs that China will rise in a peaceful way. The other one would say, no, China will never rise peacefully because all powerful countries have gone into war one time or another. So in the end, it will the United States will still prevail in international politics. So this is something very interesting. Like Huntington was saying, there will be a clash of civilization, the end of history. So in this context, I would like very much to our panelists to discuss on that later on. But then I will also like to focus on some of the foreseeable impact, not very specific one, but what will be the general impact of this changing China-India relations, China-US relations also. I am more interested in humanistic approach. I kind of not detest, I like reading strategic studies, but somehow I have a different opinion about the whole strategic thinking as a whole. So I'll put some issues on that one also. And then more specifically, I am interested to look the domestic component of all these states, like domestic component of China, domestic component of United States. And I would suggest not only this triangular relations between, for example, are you listening me? Hello?
Yes.
Yeah, we can hear you.
It's quite clear, sir. No.
Hello?
Yeah, we are hearing you very well.
Is it clear?
Yes, very clear.
Yeah, okay, that's good. Yeah, there came some message that I am not, my internet is not connecting. Yes, yeah, well, I am more interested to look the domestic component of foreign policy of these states, and also not only focus on triangular relation, for example, between China, US, and Asia, or South Asia, or Nepal, but I would like to see this discussion through a quadruple perspective, including China also. Since Russia in itself is a very powerful state still, so we should not minimize the position of Russian position in international politics, whether in Asia or outside world. Whenever we talk about China and the United States or India, we should always include Russia in that point. But this is my point, and in the end, I would, if I have a time, I will focus on Nepal also. First, there are several narratives and issues relating China-US relations. And when I make my literature review, I see this interesting narratives like rivalry, enmity, coming war on China. These are the three interesting narratives that I have seen in different literature, which is very interesting for us to discuss. What does that mean? What does rivalry means? What does enmity means? What does coming war on China narrative means for us to understand and to find the alternative approach? That is one thing. And obviously there are several issues. There are a gamut of issues relating China and the United States. There are peace and security, human rights, democracy, sustainable development, trade and development, so and so. There are many other issues also. But for me, when somebody talks or use the terminology rivalry between US and China, what does it mean? And similarly, when somebody use enmity, what does it mean? What does it signify? What does it entail? And these are very interesting things, not only from academic point of view, but also from practical implication point of view. For example, when somebody writes China-US rivalry, that means that there is still some ground for Asian state to maneuver their diplomatic activities and find some alternative for peaceful coexistence. But when some writers are writing, oh, enmity between China and India, then there is no chance for diplomatic maneuvering except for joining one side or other side. So these are very important narratives, I think. We are interested to talk about those issues. One has to be very careful. And then also, in what context we are talking about, and how do we find an alternative approach to this war, hysteria, racism, East versus West. So this is very important in from my point of view. Now, I would focus some very general issues that has been in the discussion in the recent years. What are the current issues relating China and the United States? Obviously, COVID, and then WHO, Hong Kong. These are the current issues that has been discussed relating China-India relations, China-US relations. And the US president, the current US president, had blamed China as a currency manipulator, but it has not shown any effect, anything. And there was also talk about Trans-Pacific Partnership, which has not been passed also. And obviously, United States wants to use Taiwan issue against China, that everybody knows. And on the other hand, the militarization of whole South China Sea has also been in the discussion in international politics. And there is also talk in the post-COVID situation, since this China and the US relations are getting bad, maybe the Western powers, they would like to shift their investment from China to India. There is another question, but I doubt, and I will have my opinion later on. But regarding China and the United States relations, when we look the history of the China of these two countries, it's a very interesting one. In my opinion, these two countries cannot live without each other. Imagine the development of the United States during the time when they were developing their railways. It was the Chinese worker who helped them, who were working there. And during the Soviet time also, Nixon and Kissinger preferred Chinese communist relations than Soviet communist. So I am rather very curious whether or not this rhetorics and the war, the words of war and rivalry are being used at this moment of time. Maybe when there is a change in the political power in the United States, when there is a next president coming, perhaps things will not be as they are now. So in my view, the persons and politics matters. So this rhetoric by the Trump administration is out of proportion. So I am rather more positive and optimistic that the relationship between China and India will not go, between the United States and China will not be deteriorated to the extent of war and conflict. So this is I may be wrong, but this is what I think from the historical perspective. But at the same time, there are certain foreseeable impacts that could happen, that will be on the South Asia or Southeast Asia or the world at large also. One of the foreseeable impact is the arms race and arms trade. Like, for example, only last week, India approved purchase of 21 Russian missiles and other missiles as a result of the conflict between China and India. There will be arms race and arms conflict, arms race as well as arms trade. Obviously, that will threaten regional and international peace and security. It will harm economic cooperation and sustainable development. That is another reason that I'm saying that we as a academician, we have to give an alternative approach to this war versus war rivalry and coming war on China, or even from looking from the domestic policy component point of view. United States will change sooner or later. It will be forced to accept that, I think. And this is the reason why I believe in that one. When we look international politics through the lenses of quadruple power perspective, including China and the United States on the one side, India and Russia on the other, we see completely a different picture. This is one of the my favorite statement by Harvard Jean, the professor who wrote A People's History of the United States. He has very brilliantly or sarcastically said that war is the economy of the United States. And based on this idea, there has been so many conspiracy theory written about that. But just a minute, just let's see all these four power, China and the United States, Russia and India, will it be really helpful for them to go into war, for example? First of all, waging a war at this moment of time is humanly not sensible in my view. But in a real politics, in reality of life, it may be that United States is inclined to exploit China inter-border conflict for its own advantage. That would be a possible thing from the imperialistic point of view. But at the same time, if India wants to wage war against China on behalf of the United States, that will not be helpful for India either. I mean, we have to analyze from the rational point of view, not irrational point of view, believing that every individual is rational, is not irrational. So in that situation, if Russia is asked support by India, Russia might have to look its own interest also. It may remain neutral, or it may side China, or it may side India. So, so this is also not possible from a Russian point of view, that they will go for this war, adventure, and conflict. So I think that these 3-4 power will have to reconsider themselves. Whatever is the rhetoric in the newspaper and statement, in their inner circle, they have to rethink. And I believe that they are human beings. But on the other hand, what Harvard Jean have brilliantly said, that war is a failure of all human senses. So we don't know which leader will lose its senses and trigger the button of war. That's also a consideration. We can just write out, oh, there will be no conflict and nothing like that. But in a rational way, if we believe we all are human beings, we have still a idea of humanity. I don't think that there will be a direct war between the United States and China. And of course, again, there is a possibility that somebody can lose his mind. One problem that why I have some kind of reservation accepting the strategic thinking is because most of the strategic thinking study people, they talk about, oh, which country is powerful, killing how many people of other country, and which country have a how many weapons of mass destruction also. So this is also another problem, I think. But what I am more interested in is that we can find a humanistic approach, although it is a very controversial, it is a very idealistic idea, but there are still possibilities that we as a human being can develop a humanistic approach to international politics. Why this is very important is that most strategic thinkers, they talk about strategy, they talk about tactics, they talk about roadmaps, but without looking a very wide landscape. And for them, peace and security or peace and justice are most of the time, for most of them, are zero-sum game. So we need an alternative approach. The way we have been taught in the last 150 years, especially in the last 60, 70 years, there has been always this idea that, oh, one country is posed against another country. And this is what is the problem of clash of civilization, end of history, whether West has lost or East has opened, this kind of thing. So somehow the whole narratives and the terminology are themselves have become a part of the conflict in itself. So why I'm developing this logic that we have to look into it, the domestic perspective, and why we should have an alternative approach is because of this. Look, for example, at the United States, it's the domestic component of its foreign policy. And believe it or not, there has been so many discussion about, since Watergate and Vietnam War, America lost its democratic image. And especially since 2001, the election scenario, the fiasco, everybody knows. And people's participation in democratic politics in the United States is a truly problem, even looking from the Northern European point of view. And this COVID economic situation and post-COVID situation is serious in the United States as it is elsewhere. So if we look at from the domestic component point of view, domestic politics point of view, and it's a problem in the United States. By democratic credential and democratic image, I mean that there are basic characteristics of the of democracy, social justice to the population, and also some kind of equitable development of the society. So that is very lacking in the United States also. So when you look internal politics of the United States, it doesn't look as smart and as powerful as it used to be in the 60s and 70s. So this is one thing one has to be very careful in analyzing. Regarding China, China is a unstoppable, maybe unstoppable economic power, but there are also limitations. For example, it lacks Western type of democracy. Rightly, the earlier speaker have already said there is a conflict between what kind of democracy we think about or talk about. But still, whether one democracy or other democracy is right or wrong, but somehow it is facing the Western pressure, including from India. The internal conflict exists in China, we have to acknowledge it. Taiwan and Tibet issues are still there, whether internally they may not be important, but externally they are being used or misused. But at the same time, looking China from the internal point of view, it is the largest investor in the world in terms of research and development, and this will be the determining factor in future. China is investing in research and development today, the amount combined more than combined Western Europe and the United States. And I don't know if this statistic is right or wrong, but I read somewhere that out of 1,500 richest people in the world, there are 10,000 Chinese people. So this is the shift. And also, as it has been investing so much in research and development, China is technologically advancing very rapidly. So this is the thing. And this is the domestic component of Chinese thing, I think. Yes, there are weaknesses, there are strengths, but at the same time, I don't think China is an offensive war by China to either to United States or South Asia or India will be its own interest also. Chinese diplomacy understands very well. This is my personal opinion, I think. And then India, as I said, we have to look from a quadruple power perspective.
Katak sir,
obviously,
Katak sir, sorry to interrupt you, but you have to sum up within 2 minutes. Will you please?
All right. But but the Indian also is catching up. But there are the problem of democratic credentials. This latest religion issue have been casting shadow over its democratic credential. Internal problem existing, like for Kashmir, and Maoist problem. And then Russia would like to reassert its old image, but there are problems there also. Well, I'm just passing by all those things. And finally, what I want to say in Nepal is that I think all panelists here knows what is happening in Nepal, this border issue and publication of new map. What I think is an alternative approach for Nepal, and looking from a humanitarian point of view, Nepal's foreign policy makers should propose a demilitarization of Kalapani, Lipu Lake, and Limpuyadhura. And this should be talked both with China and India. And that is the right thing to do. And this is the humanitarian thing to do. And final point, one second, final point, any country which is domestically weak, undemocratic, socially unjust can never succeed in international arena playing international power. And finally, even the most powerful empires in the past have fallen down because of their internal weaknesses rather than from outside power. So this is my final point. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Katak sir, for your very insightful presentation. We will come back to you after this this round ends with some questions from the participants. Now it's a time to listen to the presentation from Dr. Nishchal Nath Pandey. Dr. Pandey, you have the floors.
Thank you, Yubaraj, for this opportunity. I would like to thank the organizers of this webinar for this timely discussion on United States, China, and the implications for South Asia. I think it's a topic that is a mouthful, but I'll do my best. I will not take much of your time. We've already heard from our Chinese friend as well as from Katak ji on the enormous ramifications of this growing rivalry between United States and China. And this has historically been a fact as well, that there is always a conflict between a power that is already risen and an aspiring power, whether we go to medieval times or whether we go to the Roman Empire or the Greek Empire. So therefore, this is nothing new as far as humanity is concerned. There has always been a contest between a power that is aspirant to be a superpower and a power that wants a status quo. And there is always this ganging up of friends, of allies against the other. And we've seen that throughout the Cold War. But right now, the problem for Nepal as a smaller country is that during the Cold War, we were in a much comfortable place. United States and Soviet Union were rivals, but we were able, through our diplomatic acumen, to take economic support, financial assistance for our development activities. So if you see, a lot of industries around Nepal have actually been constructed by the Russians, by the Soviets. For instance, the cement factories, Rosin and Turpentine Limited, and many other, there are a lot of engineers right now who are in their 50s, 60s who have studied in Soviet Union, and a lot of medical doctors. So actually we gained from that rivalry between the United States and the USSR, the former USSR. The Americans also assisted us a lot in terms of malaria eradication, for instance, Peace Corps volunteers, military training to military officers of the then Royal Nepal Army. And many examples can be given where Nepal has actually gained during the Cold War because of this contest between the two established superpowers of the world. And in terms of our international engagement also, we were able to reap benefits. We were twice member of the United Nations Security Council, and both of them were during the Cold War. The Vice President of the United States visited Nepal, the President of the Soviet Union visited Nepal. And it's remarkable that Nepal's head of state was given a singular honor to address the joint houses of Congress in the United States in the 60s. It was a very rare honor that head of state of Nepal would go to Washington, D.C. to address the joint session of the Congress. So I think we were able to take benefit out of the rivalry between the United States and Soviet Union, both in terms of political and in terms of economic and in terms of training and scholarships for our benefit. But that was a different time. And the difference that I see now is that both the United States and Soviet Union were very far away from us. Geographically, and Mr. Sheng has also mentioned, the Americans and the Russians, both of them are very far away from us. So we had really no danger, no risk at all to maintain good relations with both of them at the same time. So simultaneously, we were able to take benefit, and but there was no real risk because both of them were so far away. But now the problem is that there is going to be contest and strategic rivalry in our neighborhood. And that poses us in a very, very difficult situation. So talking about the Indo-China border problem, Indo-Pakistan border problem, talking about American-India engagement as part of the Quad, talking about Indo-Pacific Strategy. Now, all these poses enormous amount of challenges to Nepal's foreign policy, because that directly implies that we are going to side with the one and alienate the other, and which we cannot afford as a small nation. Nepal simply cannot afford to be so close to one power that we will start alienating the other, because that exposes us directly to the other power. And we have never done that in history. We have tried it, but it has always been at the risk of the regime, at the risk of our government of the day, and somehow it has not worked in our favor. So India and China coming together very warmly also does not suit us, as it did not suit us in 2014 when both of them spoke about a trilateral junction in the border for bilateral trade without informing the third party, which is Nepal. India and China both agreed for bilateral trade through Lipulik. But we consider that our territory. And we strongly objected to that, to both Beijing and to New Delhi. But both of them did not care at all. So that is one sign of what happens when they come very close to one another. And there is now on the extreme other side, when they start conflicting with each other, when there are border problems, when there are skirmishes in the border, that also poses enormous risk for Nepal. So either when India and China come very close to one another, almost on a romantic kind of a relationship, it affects us. And when they become enemies and when they start fighting with one another, then also that poses enormous risk for Nepal's independent foreign policy conduct. Now, in terms of the United States, let me also point out that there are a lot of challenges coming our way. I know there is problem of higher prices for consumers because of the trade war. There are going to be financial difficulties for farmers and manufacturers. And this is coming at a time of COVID-19. So the entire economy is on severe recession. Our economy is virtually closed. There is no tourism. Our airport is closed. There are no flights operating, and we are an economy that is heavily dependent on remittance income and on tourism income, and both of them are under severe stress. So therefore, we cannot afford this kind of a timing when we are under a COVID-19 pandemic. It's spreading in the society. We have not been able to contain it. Economy is under very severe stress. Remittance is declining. Tourism is virtually zero. Hotels are closed. And at the same time, then we face a problem with on our foreign policy. I think this is a timing that has really gone bad, and where we need to, I think, equip ourselves. Now, on the case of relationship, let us not be, too complacent of a particular relationship. We have a relationship with India that dates back to time immemorial. We have had religious, cultural, linguistic, matrimonial ties with India. We have an open border with India. And let us not forget that kind of a closeness. Talking with the United States, let us not forget that we established diplomatic relations with the United States before we did with India and China. It's a very strange kind of a diplomatic history. So before we set up diplomatic ties with both of our neighbors, here we were setting up diplomatic ties with the United States of America. So that is also a very unique characteristic of Nepal's foreign policy. And with China, as was mentioned, we have a very close relationship. And nowadays it is no longer enough to say Nepal-China relations. It is which aspect of Nepal-China relations? Is it investment? It is trade? Is it tourism? It is economic, political? Is it optical fiber? Is it cultural? Is it educational? A lot of Nepalese students study in China. They work in China nowadays. This is a relationship that is now, whose canvas has now really enlarged. You cannot really talk about Nepal-China relations in 1 hour anymore. It's a huge canvas. And, I was talking to a politician friend just yesterday, and I said, our own parliament building was constructed by the Chinese. It's actually on rent. That building is Birendra International Convention Center, BICC, whose B has been deleted and remains to be ICC, but that was Convention Center constructed by the Chinese. And now our parliament is on rent from the past 10 years with the convention hall, and our parliament building is now under construction. So therefore, that is the relationship, and I think we need to nurture this aspect of the economic relationship. Look at the aspect of connectivity. There are more flights today, if the flights were operational before the COVID-19, more flights to Chinese cities from Kathmandu than there are to Indian cities. That is the flow of passengers. We are connected directly to Lhasa, Chengdu, Guangzhou, Kunming, Xi'an, and Hong Kong. So that makes it 6 cities, and only 4 cities on the other side. So the volume of trade, of investment, volume of tourists, passengers has really gone up to the northern side. So Mr. Sheng mentioned about BRI, and I'd like to come to that. We have already joined the BRI, we have already joined the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, etc. But the issue here is, I think we really need to showcase a big BRI project which has become very successful. And that is imperative for South Asia. Because I am a board member in various institutes in South Asia. I think I go to Colombo very often, Maldives, recently in Dhaka. All of my South Asian friends agree that we need to have a BRI project which can be termed as a showcase for everybody to see. It can be CPEC, China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. It can be the railway from Golmu to Lhasa, Shigatse, and there to Nepal, whatever. But some project has to be there for everybody to see that this is the success of BRI and this is the mega project that is now operational. Otherwise, we have been talking about it in Track 2 conferences for such a long time that I think it will be repetitive to talk about it here. That is very important, and I think China side will take it very as an urgent need. On the question of post-COVID-19 world order, I think this is going to be very problematic for smaller countries. The American foreign policy behavior under Trump administration has been, I would say, unpredictable, which everybody says. It is an unpredictable administration. He's very active in Swiss social media, in Twitter. Many times he has tweeted something in the morning and he has countered in the evening. And this is a president that is now going to go for elections very soon. There is elections in America in November. What is going to happen in the United States in the post-election scenario will determine the entire, I think, the international world order, because if it is a democratic administration, probably it will have to go for a rethink of many of the policies that Trump administration took. If it is a continuation of President Trump, then we see, I think, more turbulence coming in the way of Asia as a whole, because then countries will be forced to take sides, which we are simply unable to do, because the geographical location of Nepal is such that we just simply cannot take sides between India and China. We simply cannot take sides between China and any other country, because this is, China, as you mentioned, is a reality. It's our northern neighbor. And India is also our reality. It borders us from 3 different sides. And therefore, this is going to be a turbulent period in international relations. But this is the time when we have to strengthen multilateral organizations. Now, unfortunately, for the first time in history, United Nations General Assembly may not be taking place this year in September. That would have been a good platform for all these discussions. What about SAARC, where China is an observer, where India and Pakistan are members? All these things could be thrashed out in that regional organization. We have invested a lot in that organization. It's our organization. We pay for it, yet we have allowed it to sleep. That is a tragedy for our region. What about BIMSTEC? What about BBIN? What about Shanghai Cooperation Organization? Now, these regional organizations are very important during crisis times. These are the platforms where leaders meet, where foreign ministers meet, and they can talk and negotiate and discuss about these issues. Many of these platforms do not allow bilateral political tensions to be discussed at the formal level, but informally, foreign ministers and foreign secretaries and heads of governments have always been talking about bilateral problems and disputes. But this time, unfortunately, regional organizations has also been allowed to decay over time. And this comes at a time of heightened tensions in South Asia. So therefore, I do see a lot of challenges coming our way. As for Nepal, I think we need a very robust foreign policy. Our ambassadors need to be proactive around the world. We have to keep our eyes and ears open. And if there is a need, we have to keep our mouth open also and meet media persons, because this is a time of media and social media is having a lot of impact. We cannot afford to side by one country and alienate the other, as I mentioned. And we have to see that if there is any opportunity for Nepal in terms of economy, then we have to really snatch it, because at the moment, the biggest challenge for Nepal is going to be its economy. We are really very badly hit in all sectors of our economy. And if we do not really focus on it, we are going to be a casualty. And is this a time to, alienate China? Is this a time to alienate India? Because, here we are in a midst of a huge pandemic and our economy is in a recession. We simply need their generous assistance, not only in terms of medical supplies, but also in terms of other, probably in the post-COVID situation, we may even need big grants and loans to keep our economy afloat. So I think in conclusion, Mr. Chaulagain, I'd like to mention that this has been a very informative session. I think you should build it up. I really gained from Mr. Sheng's presentation, and Katak sir's presentation has always been very good. We need to build it up. We need to take this dialogue forward and also bring the young generation of both our countries together. And I try to also expand it to other South Asian countries like Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, Maldives, because the situation there is pretty much similar to what we are seeing here in Nepal. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Nishchal sir, for your insightful remarks on the issue. Now we will go to the question and answer session. We already have maybe 9-10 questions in our question box. So without further delay, I would quickly jump into the questions. Maybe this first question is to Mr. Sheng Zhang. What would you like, Mr. Zhang, to take all the questions for you, or one by one?
I can just take one by one. Okay, choose which one to answer first?
Yeah. So this is for you. How about the BRI to create debt traps for host countries so that China could increase their influences and interference in geopolitical and economic policy of host nation? That is
Yeah, so yeah, regarding this,
very briefly.
I mean, yeah. So I do not deny the fact that China wants to enlarge our influence, but I do not believe in the narrative of that trap, because at least right now we don't see clear example of what, when people are talking about that traps, what they're talking about. There is no such a obvious event which makes you to believe that this is that trap. Like the only thing that people always use as a case is the port in Sri Lanka, in which China has the right of operation. But right of operation is very different from right of sovereignty. China does not get to own the port. It's the right of operation, and this thing can be taken back. And for the same issue, we're doing same with Israel. We're renting the Haifa harbor from Israel. Does this mean that we dragged Israel into that trap as well? Does this not mean that we colonized Israel? I don't think that's what makes sense. Same, why do we say the different thing when it applies to Sri Lanka, right? So, and also for a lot of examples, I can give like hundreds of examples of how China is willing to negotiate with countries from Africa, from Asia, from anywhere, about when they have difficulties paying debt. And China is willing to just forget some of this debt and to give them more time, or to let them have other ways to pay back the debt, which, I mean, for the example of Iraq, is like Iraq can directly give oil. For the same, for the same thing with Venezuela as well. So so the Chinese are very willing to negotiate, and I yet to see any actual facts illustrating that there's actually a debt trap existing. Yeah.
Okay. Another question for you from our participant. Thank you, Sheng, for your insightful presentation. You have covered the US-China realities that contain China thesis. The US is selling throughout the globe, and particularly comparing IPS and BRI vis-a-vis Nepal is important. I appreciate your stand and logic. In the meantime, as you have mentioned, the Western-centric world order is coming to an end, and it is clearly seen under Trump administration that the way he has been dealing in global issues and with global institutions. Will you please share some more points how the South-South cooperation could lead to a new shape of world order? So this is the question.
Okay, yeah. So at this moment, we have to acknowledge the fact that it takes a long time for us to reshape the existing world order, because as we know, we can't ignore the West, right? The West still remains the most dominant actor of the international stage. But there's this trend that I'm talking about, is that the influence of the West is decreasing. And there's this long-term trend that the new emerging economies, such as the BRICS countries, they're like performing very well. I mean, right now there's some difficulties with Brazil because with the current administration. But at least if we look at the data from China and from India and from ASEAN as a whole, we would see that first their economy is performing relatively well in this large background which everyone is having difficulty. And also second thing is that we see regional integration of the economy. And there's a lot of future directions. We would see, like, for example, China is trying to form the East Asian economic free zone with Korea and Japan, but this can expand in the future, and this can expand to larger trade platforms with ASEAN countries, with South Asian countries as well. So there's a new platform, there's new opportunity, there's new markets, and right now, because United States is acting like crazy. United States is acting crazy while Europe is relatively weak, not as influential as it was before. So in a lot of international organizations, intergovernmental organizations, there's more opportunity and more room for developing countries to play. So I think there's this larger trend that we have to act right now, but it takes like a decade or so, or even longer, 2 decades, 3 decades for us to complete this large task of reshaping the world order. But it's happening, and the trend is on our side as developing countries.
All right. I think there is a similar like question, maybe that is for you as well. As you said, South-South cooperation, a new future. You believe, is it possible to put aside Western power in terms of global security and global economy? Would you like to respond or this?
Yeah, I can respond to this one. It's never like, we never want to do that. It's never like a plan that we just ignore or aside Western powers, especially right now, because it's not practical at all. And even in the future, I don't see how we can just like ignore the West. But the problem is that, the point is that we need to adjust the unbalanced world order at this moment. So it doesn't mean that we have to totally replace the West and totally like ignore them. But the problem is that we need to point out the problem of the existing world order dominated by the West, and we have to challenge this unjust world order dominated by the West for the interest of the unprivileged people of the world, which means the people of the developing country, people of the underdeveloping country, people of the third world, that we need to have more of a voice, more influence in the international stage. And we have to challenge the existing order. This doesn't mean that we have to totally overthrow it. And this doesn't mean that we are going to ignore the West, which is not even practical. And I never proposed that. What I'm talking about is that we need to challenge the existing unjust world order, but we don't need to necessarily overthrow or totally replace it.
All right. So I think there are 2 more questions for you, and then after we will go to the other panelists. Maybe this second last for you. Why do you think there is urgency of national independence of Nepal, which you just maybe you use this word? Okay. Which is, I think, very new terms and perspective for political history of Nepal. Yeah.
I mean, I don't think that Nepal has an urgency of national independence, but I do. I mean, please correct me if I'm wrong because I'm a foreigner. But according to my limited understanding, I believe that Nepal is facing some sort of insecurity in terms of national independence, because as we know, like Nepal in history, Nepal is it's a country with a splendid history and historically also a very strong country of South Asia as well. But in relatively recent decades, we see that Nepal is, in terms of economic relations, is sort of like dependent on India for like under this umbrella of so-called special relationship, which in my opinion, a lot of like special relationship thing is sort of unreliable. And it's like in a lot of cases, Nepal is not perfectly self-sustainable or like self-independent. India normally uses blockades, economic blockades and those sort of things to enforce what it wants. And India also has some sort of influence over the domestic politics of Nepal. So that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about like possible threats of national independence. This doesn't mean it's urgency. It's not that urgent, but it's certainly not something that I think a sovereign state would want to. So it's in Nepal's interest of diversify its partnership with countries. I think that's what relatively small countries have been doing throughout history. So that's what I mean when I'm talking about national independence. Yeah.
Yeah, so there is one more question. I guess another question also is there for you. So we'll come back to you again, maybe after this question, because there are other questions for the other panelists as well.
Yeah.
China is having border issues with many of its neighbors. How can China cope up with such things to win the trust from them to be the world power? So this is another question.
Yeah. So, okay.
Yeah.
On this thing, I'm going to clarify one thing, is that China only have a land territorial dispute with 2 neighbors. China has already solved all the land territorial dispute with all of our neighbors except 2. One is India. Another is Bhutan, which is under Indian influence. Those are only 2. So we don't have a lot of territorial dispute with lots of neighbors. I don't see that. The only thing that I think what's in people's mind is the South China Sea dispute, or like the maritime dispute between China and Japan. Those things exist, but those things, I want to clarify one thing. Chinese stance on those issues has never changed. So since Deng Xiaoping's period, Deng Xiaoping said something that he said, oh, we still have our claim over those islands and we are open to negotiate. But right now, we don't have the ability to actually govern those islands. So we're going to put it off, but reserving our stance. That's what he says. And right now, under different scenario, China is much stronger than it was before, and China has the ability to enforce what it claim has always been. So the claim exists. The only difference is that historically China does not have the power to enforce, to govern those islands, but right now China has the power to govern those islands. So that's why it seems like the South China Sea issue like suddenly bumps out, but that's not what is happening. So regarding this, China is open to negotiate with all of those maritime states who share the maritime border with us. And one thing I want to stress is that China does not have new territorial claims. This doesn't exist. What China claimed before is what China is claiming right now, and it will be China, all that China claims for the future. And those are for negotiation. So we don't do things such as recognizing a border and then invade those territories, which is like, I mean, like unlike what India did on the Sikkim case, like on the Sikkim border between China and former Sikkim, or right now India, is that historically they recognize the border, but then during the Donglang standoff, they suddenly don't recognize the border anymore. But we don't do that. You can't find that in Chinese diplomatic history. So this means that Chinese have insistence on its territorial claims. And this means that China has good credit on its territorial disputes. So I don't see how China can be seen as this expensive and aggressive country constantly breaking promise and making people don't want to trust it. Yeah.
All right. So I think this is that was the last question for you.
Okay.
Now the question for both the remaining panelists. So I would like to ask this question to Dr. Malla. Dr. Malla, are you getting me? I guess you are.
Yes, I can listen to you. Yeah.
Yeah, one of our participants writes, my appreciation for the coverage you have made. As you have mentioned, divergent theoretical ground of contemporary international relations theory, in your opinion, statement illustrating Huntington, Fukuyama, Masmeyer, etc. How do you see the probable new Cold War between the US and China or will it go to offensive as Marsmeyer opined, or defensive and maintain balance of power the way Kenneth was illustrated analyzing international politics during the Cold War? This is the question. I guess you get it.
Yeah, I think I have read it already. And what happened? Hello?
Yeah, please. Yeah, we are doing it. Yeah.
Well, I would like to give a very short answer to this question. And as I said in my presentation earlier on, war is the loss of the human sense. No sensible person would like to go to war. And that is a fact. But when human leaders lose their senses, anything can happen. It has happened before. It could happen before. But my impression and my understanding is that we select leaders who are rational, who are human, who will avoid war. Okay, so my understanding that United States, for example, as I was saying earlier on, if India is interested to wage war against China on behalf of United States, that is not conceivable. And same thing, if China goes offensive against India or anything else, and I don't conceive that either, that will be against their national interest itself. So when we look at all those parameters and all those things, it doesn't look any sensible thing to go into war. Of course, there are other things, but regarding it could happen Cold War. Yeah, Cold War is one thing, and very brutal war is another thing. And the Cold War signs are already there, but it has not already affected so much. As last year, the trade balance or imbalance between the United States and China, it is still not that has not affected so much as it could have been. So my analysis is that we can think for the best and prepare for the worst. Think for the best, the leadership, meaning that they take decision in a very rational way, not only just to go to the war, but also to think after what happens. So that is one thing. But regarding the Cold War, and maybe there are some local conflict will be on the rise, like it has already been on the point, like the conflict between India and China regarding the border conflict, the conflict between Nepal and India. Those kind of conflict could come up, but not the full war, I think, and nobody expect those kind of things. That is why it could be a balance of power. And also, when I was talking about the narratives, it is important what narrative you use. For example, rivalry is not a bad thing among nation states. And when there is a rivalry, then there is a balance of power possibility. But when there is an enmity between the two or more than two, then obviously they will go to the war. It's a very theoretical thing and also of practical importance. That is what I am much more interested to see. How do we see the practice through theory? How do we theorize the practice and also see practice through the theoretical perspective? So looking from that point of view, I don't think that it is anybody's interest, neither Indian interest, nor Chinese interest, nor Russian interest, nor American interest to go into war regarding China. It doesn't look sensible. But again, I said there are sensible leaders sometimes, they can do that. So my expectation is that after the election in the United States, the coming election, if there is a leadership change, things would be cooled down.
Yeah, there are two more questions, but I think these are unrelated to the topic. Would you like to respond?
Yes, if it is, I have no problem.
Yeah, it's for you, but this is maybe not related to the topic, but this is mentioned here. My question goes to Malla sir. What do you think about racism in Nepal and other Asian countries? This is one. Would you like
Well, of course. I mean, racism is also part of nationalism. Nationalism is also part of international politics. Okay. Well, there are differences between patriotism and nationalism. As one of my favorite book was written by George Orwell, Notes on Nationalism and Patriotism. But let's not go onto that level. There are racism everywhere. Scandinavia is full of racism nowadays. America is full of racism nowadays. Racism is spreading everywhere. And as a result of this racism, there is a xenophobic nationalism also. So, I mean, it is so important for us as an academician to see all those threats and all those currents and narratives. So for me, yes, there is a racism in Nepal. There is a racism in Sweden too. So in Sweden, there is already a political party in the parliament which is threatening the whole democratic system in Sweden. So yes, there are problems in racism, but I think the questioner have some kind of inclination that I was talking about Nepali national song and the race theory being implemented into the constitution. So I did not like when we sing Jat, the race, okay? And there are so many sub-classification of humankind that has been classified into Nepali constitution. I mean, I think that maybe the person who is raised the question is interested. Maybe he has heard my earlier interview somewhere. I think the modern constitution of Nepal, not all, but the part of modern constitution of Nepal is based on race theory.
All right. Yeah, there is another question. Maybe this is a national rather than this related to this topic. What do you think about Maoist movement in Nepal? So very briefly, sir.
Maoist movement?
Yeah, this is his question.
Oh yeah, I think this person must have heard my earlier interview somewhere. You know what I have been saying, that there is one Maoist fraction who has been outlawed now today, the Chanda group or Biplab group, okay? So my point is that as there is a national crisis coming up regarding the border issue and the rising tension between India and China, the best thing for Nepal's government is to give general amnesty to Maoists and bring them to the fold, if you are talking about that Maoist. But the rest of the Maoists are in power, Maoist, Marxist, Leninist are in together. I doubt if there are true communists or not. We could do different discussion about that, but at least they have a Maoist name. If they have a communist name, they have a Leninist name. But one problem regarding Nepali communists is that they never talk about Kerala communists. I wish they would talk. And I think the most successful communist party in the world is the Kerala Communist Party, Marxist. Think about that.
All right. I think this is all for you. So maybe Dr. Pandey is here. I will come back to you, Dr. Malla, if there are more questions, if that comes. Now to Dr. Nishchal Nath Pandey. I will start with this question. As you mentioned, Nepal cannot take any side in any affairs that contains weight between our neighbors or with friendly nations. This is the crux of existing Nepalese foreign policy. But the way we are divided in our domestic politics, it has its impact in its international affairs. Despite being natural and balanced, we do have issues that we are divided severely. How do you see the global power penetration inside Nepalese domestic domestic domains that let foreign interest playing in Kathmandu except Nepalese national interest? This is the question. I guess you got it.
I saw the question in the Q&A here also. One thing about Kerala that Professor Malla mentioned is very, very amusing. I think the reason why we don't mention about Kerala model is that that's the only state of the whole of India where the Communist Party is actually ruling today.
Yes.
That's the only state, because they used to be a very large political party and even coalition partners during UPA 1, but now they rule only Kerala. They used to rule Tripura also. I think they lost Tripura. I think that is the reason why I think under BJP rule, it is diplomatically unwise to mention about the Communist Party of a very small state of South India. That is the reason of it. On the issue of, there is a question on Gorkha soldiers also I saw in the Q&A. Yubaraj, if I can join the two things together.
Yeah, please.
Because I think it's a historical reality that there was a tripartite agreement when the British left the subcontinent that Nepalese Gorkhas would be separated into one Gorkha brigade for the British Army, and the three of them would be going to the Indian Army. And that tradition has been allowed to go on. The only caveat being that we have always stressed that the Nepalese citizens should not be used in conflicts against Hindus and against our friendly neighbors or friendly countries. But that has been consistently violated. It was violated in the Falklands War in Argentina because we don't have any problems with Argentina. Most Argentinians would never know, probably not know where Nepal is situated and what enmity we have with them. Because that was mentioned in the Falklands War that what enmity do you have with us? And they were also used against the LTT in Sri Lanka. And that also was because the group was basically of Hindu religion. I think that always remains embarrassing when Nepalese citizens die in a foreign land, trying to protect a foreign country, whether it is during the Gulf War, whether on the Afghanistan front, in Iraq, during India-Pakistan conflict, Indo-China conflict. It's always embarrassing when Nepalese citizens die in a foreign country. But that has been also on the reverse side. That also gives us a lot of remittance money for, they earn a lot of money and then they send it back to the rural areas of Nepal. But that also has now been changing because the communist parties have been championing the cause that Nepalese should not be allowed to go into foreign armies to work for foreign forces. And the British, what they did was that they have now changed the system. Now Nepalese soldiers after retirement are allowed to stay in the UK, and they are also allowed to bring their families from the Nepali villages to the UK. Now that completely, does not give us any benefit at all, because once in a retirement phase, if they would go back to Nepal, they would bring the expertise, they would bring the money, and they would, support our rural economy. But if they are allowed to stay in the UK and bring their parents also in the UK, then what is the use of it? We are sending our boys in their prime youth to work, and when they are in fairly, getting their pension, then they are allowed to stay there. So that does not really benefit us at all. In the COVID situation, in the pandemic, we saw a lot of Nepalese being sick in the UK, and they were from, I think, from the same families. The elderly population who went there, who were allowed to go to the UK and for settlement and so forth. So therefore, this issue of Gorkha recruitment is political. I think the decision has to be political. Constantly, some political parties have kept it in the manifesto, election manifesto, that if we come to power, we will stop Gorkha recruitment. But it has never happened. I think this remains to be one of the thorny issues of Nepal's foreign policy in the modern era. On the second question of what are the benefits and what are the risks? Well, risks I have already spoken, because there is a real danger of Nepal becoming another Afghanistan if we cannot really handle this situation carefully. How did Afghanistan happen? It was pretty much the same case. Afghanistan was stable during the rule of the king, Zahir Shah. And post Zahir Shah, we saw Afghanistan going into chaos. Intervention by Soviet Union, civil war, backing by the Americans for the Mujahideen, and what have you now? We have completely gone to the full circle of the situation. And I think that is a good example, and also a landlocked country. So we really have to see the example of Afghanistan and not to take that route, because at the moment there is growing power rivalry, interest of extra regional powers in the domestics of your country, then there is, and if you are unable to handle it to your benefit, then there is a danger that your country can become another Afghanistan. And I think our present day leaders have to be really serious about it. So instead of political wrangling and infighting, we need to focus on rejuvenating our economy and guaranteeing political stability and having good relations with both our neighbors and also our extended neighborhood. So if we are unable to do that, there are potential risks. And as US-China rivalry intensifies, as China-India rivalry intensifies, our role is going to be crucial. We saw in 1962 that the Bhutanese airspace was used during the 1962 Indo-China war, but we did not allow our airspace or our land to be used by either India or China during the war, and we remained neutral, and it was appreciated by both the parties at that time. I think we can always maintain that neutrality. We can always be a hub of track 2 events and dialogues and free and frank exchange of ideas. Everybody is welcome in Nepal, the Indians, the Chinese, the Pakistanis, Sri Lankans, Americans, everyone. I think this Kathmandu, the city, can always be developed, and it has to be encouraged to be developed as the Brussels of South Asia. In fact, it is the Brussels of South Asia, where everybody can come very easily and exchange ideas. And the SAARC Secretariat is also here in Kathmandu. But if we are unable to manage these relationships, these conflicting relationships, then we are in real danger of becoming another Afghanistan. So thank you.
All right, Dr. Pandey, there are another questions as well for you.
Okay.
Maybe this is not the last. What are the positive rewards a country like Nepal could have from military and economic China and US rivalry? And what would be negative consequences for Nepal?
Well, that I think I've already answered. The positive side, well, we have to really take the economic advantage out of all these engagements, whether it is BRI or it is other engagements. Our real focus would be, the problem here is that on the question of transit, and Mr. Sheng also mentioned about over-dependence on a single country. I think we are not over-dependent on India. We are over-dependent on the Calcutta port. And the problem of Kolkata port is now not really political, not really bureaucratic. The problem is that there is siltation, and large ships are having more and more difficulty in docking into the port, and because it's become a very busy port, and our traders, our exporters, importers are having increasing difficulty. That is the reason why we were given Visakhapatnam. And now there is also the Indo-Nepal oil pipeline, which is already constructed. So trade facilitation measures are taking place, but we also need to have those similar measures in Nepal-China context. And one way to strengthen that relationship would be for the railway that is already in Shigatse. Now, Shigatse is not very far away. Shigatse is the second biggest city of Tibet Autonomous Region. And the delay from extension from Shigatse is I think the challenge. Now, whether it is engineering or whether it is topographical, that has to be really thought over. But the moment you talk about trains, then you change the entire dynamics of our relationship. Tourists can come from that train. There can be exports, there can be imports, there can be very easy connectivity. And I think that will lessen the dependence on Kolkata port. Although the Chinese seaport is so far away, but then our dependence on a single port will be overly simplified if that train would become a reality, but it is taking a very long time. And that I think you must appreciate. So I think end with that. Yubaraj, I have to leave. I have to go somewhere.
All right.
I think my role is already over, but I really appreciated this discussion program today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Pandey. I think we have done with the questions that have been raised in our question and answer box. I appreciate your views and your presence here today with us. In fact, I would like to thank all the listeners through our Facebook Live as well. So without further delay, I would like to thank you all again to all the participants and all the speakers as well. Now, I would like to request the chair of this session, Mr. Sunil Kumar Paudel, to wrap it off with his concluding remarks. Sunil sir. Please unmute yourself. Yeah, you can speak now. No, we are not getting you, sir.
Thank you, Yubaraj. Namaste and good afternoon to everybody. Renowned speakers, gentle ladies and gentlemen. Your valued presence in this webinar has enhanced our honor. We would like to extend our thanks to all the participants, especially to the speakers, Dr. Nishchal Nath Pandey, Kathmandu, Associate Professor, Dr. Katak Malla, Sweden, and Mr. Zhang, China, for their remarkable thought expressed over here in the webinar entitled China-US Rivalry and its Implication on South Asia. Your thought-provoking speeches, I think, have provided the listeners a new kind of knowledge as an extension to their thinking. Nepal Institute of International Relations, NIIR, has been organizing webinar every week on the relevant topic, this one being the 7th. In this chronological sequence, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank also my colleagues and technical friends for their perennial cooperation to make this webinar successful. Similarly, I would like to thank the question raisers and the watchers on live Facebook whose interest in our program has encouraged us. It is obvious that due to the fast spreading and fast growing state of communication, which has caused the extended demand of the people worldwide, no country in the world in this postmodern era can claim her as totally independent, which could remain aloof without the cooperation of others. In such prevalent situation, the impact of anything borne by a country, irrespective of location, politics, and economy, affects the other in one way or other. Thus, we do believe that the Sino-US rivalry naturally creates a kind of turmoil in every country of the world, with no exception with South Asian countries. A thread of difficulty we have already witnessed in our region. The webinar naturally cannot evade the rivalry, but the opinions expressed by the scholars have revealed not only the tensions that may emerge by the rivalry, but have also suggested the concerned sides, the ways to rid of it. Once again, extending my thanks, I hereby would like to declare the end of this webinar.